Hi everyone, we all know that colonization was a bad and cruel affair. It was also very bloody. The European nations, the British, the French, the Dutch, they have colonized most of the world starting with the 15th century. When they colonized the world, they also transferred most of the wealth of the colonized nations into their home countries. This was a looting affair, and all that material wealth were transferred to their own countries. Slaves were among the looted wealth, and colonizers, in fact, were slave manufacturers. So that manufacturing process consisted of taking a raw material, the free man, and converting it into a slave. So how did colonizers manufacture slaves? In fact, the question is how a free mind is converted into a slave mind. You capture a free man in Africa, you convert it into a slave, which means you have to convert his mind into a slave mind. A free man is not an efficient slave. You can force someone to do something you want. So he may obey you just because he's afraid of your power. But a slave has a different mentality. A slave obeys you because he's a slave. He does not question the order. He just takes care of it because he's not a free man, because he doesn't have a free mind. So converting the free mind of the captured African into a slave mind was a very important and integral part of the colonization and slavery process. I used to work in West Africa in a beautiful country called Benin, facing the Atlantic. The other side of the ocean is Americas, Latin America and North America. The slavery process in what is today Benin has started as early as in the 16th century with the Portuguese. It grew up in the following centuries. Ultimately, tens of millions of slaves were transported from West Africa to Latin America or North America. How the colonization business thrived was as follows. Let's take France, a colonizing nation. They have taken over West African colonies such as what is today Senegal and Benin. Then they search for commodities that could make them money and identify slaves among other wealth. Yes, slaves were for them just any other commodity. Latin America had been colonized by the Portuguese and Spanish since 15th century. So there was almost a history of more than 100 years of colonization in Latin America. Historians think that over 80 million people were killed by the Spanish and Portuguese conquistadors of Latin America. That led to a huge demand for labor to make economic gains. At the time, Latin America had been colonized by the Portuguese and Spanish for more than 100 years. These conquistadors have overall killed over 80 million indigenous people in Latin America, according to historians. That made a huge labor deficit in Latin America to run the mines. That created a huge labor gap in Latin America. There was no men or women to run the mines, to work in the plantations, even to serve the colonial masters. So grew the slave business. Which consisted of slaves transported from West Africa to Latin America and, of course, to also North America. The slaves were transported by slave ships. But just before the slave was to be loaded to the ship, there was one thing that has to be done. There was one thing that had to be done. That is to convert the free mind of the captured African into a slave mind so that the manufacturing process is completed before the slave was loaded on the ship. A slave mind was necessary because a free mind was not as obedient and efficient as a slave to the new masters in America. How was that done? It is really a very cruel and very sad story. Remember, the free African is captured. This is already a great trauma. Suddenly you are captured. Some savage people chained you. They took you away from your town or village, and you are being transported to some unknown destination. You cannot ask any questions to them. You are whipped and you are tortured as they need. You are in a great trauma. Then, when you arrive at the port to be transported, you first have to stay 2 to 3 days in these dungeons. These dungeons are very dark places. So you are put in that dungeon. You are already traumatized. You have to stay there in this very dark place with very little food, very little water for at least 2 to 3 days. And that completes the conversion of the free mind into a slave mind. That scaredness, that ending trauma ends your conversion into a slave mind. When you leave the dungeon, you are free to accept any order as a slave, and your mind is now reconfigured, reformatted, reconfigured into a slave mind. You are ready to accept any order from your new master. Now you are ready to be transported to Latin America or North America as any other commodity. There are unfortunately very few written accounts of the experience of these unfortunate African people. One of them is Olaudah Equiano. Let's listen to him. Of course, we should also remember that the slave ships were not 5-star hotels. These ships were designed in such a way to load as many slaves as possible so that much wealth could be looted from Africa. So the slaves are placed in very low and narrow decks. They have to lie on the decks, chained. They don't have much room for movement. They have some food and water left beside themselves so that they do not die, because if they die, economically this would be a loss. So they have to bear these conditions for months until they reach the coasts of Latin America. Of course, on the way, many of them die. When they die, they are just thrown into water and the voyage continues. A rough estimate is only 60% of the Africans reached the Atlantic, reached the Latin American coast live. Let's listen to the Library of Congress. Let's listen to the Library of Congress. The memoirs of Olaudah Equiano also explains his experience in this journey. Let's listen to him. All this seamless terror, starting with the capture of the free man to the sale of slave in Latin America, was what made a slave. What was how the colonizers manufactured slaves. Now, the slave sold in Americas has a mind to accept all orders from the superior race and become a very efficient slave. Not questioning anything, is a slave behavior, and it transcends time. You can find such behavior now, you can find such behavior before, and you will find such behavior in the future. I remember talking to an African student of mine, an affluent person from West Africa. I had an experience with a student of mine from West Africa recently. I asked her native language, and she said French. I asked her again, and the answer was again French. And I told her, French is not your native language, is not your mother language. And she was surprised, and her answer was again French. Ultimately, in the end, seeing her puzzled, her friend, also from Africa, helped her and told her the same thing with some small other explanation, and ultimately she understood and told her real mother language. And she said, yes, I have a native language, I have a mother language, and it is the following. Thank you for watching, and please continue following my channel. Until next time, bye-bye.